Hello, everyone. Hope you're having a good day. We are having a clear day, at least right now. Almost spring-like this morning. This is great. All right. I try really hard. I tell myself, you're going to pick up the speed at which you cover these stories. Originally, I had planned on doing the story of Gideon just as a little side series to our little things, and it would be 5 lessons long. I think we're on number 9, and we're not going to do a lot of verses today, but it's because when you look at the Word of God, there are just amazing things in there that speak to both the human condition and the greatness and graciousness of our God. Gideon, if you remember in our story, was working as, I guess, on the family farm. He was threshing wheat. God sent what I believe was probably Jesus, called the angel of the Lord, but it's not just any angel, to come and call Gideon to a very important task. The people of Israel had been overrun by a group of people called the Midianites and also the Amalekites. This happened at various times in their history. God was calling Gideon to lead an army to free their people. They had suffered tremendously. They had cried out to God for help. All this was happening as a result of their own lack of faith and disobedience. But when God sends these kinds of events into our lives, it isn't to hurt us, it's to help get us back on course. So Gideon has a big job to do, but from the beginning, Gideon's faith is shaky. 3 times, different times before this, he asked the Lord for signs to show him, is it really you speaking? Okay, it's really you. Can I trust the promise that you gave me? Oh, let me just ask the question again. Another sign, third sign. Again, can I trust the promise that you gave me? Are you trustworthy, God? And God was patient with all that. So now we come to the point in the story where Gideon had formed an army, 35,000 men. God said, too many, and he gets it down to like 10,000 men. And then God says, too many, and he gets it down to 300 men. Now we have the situation. 300 men were going to go up against this combined army of the Midianites and the Amalekites. How many of them were there? If you were to look at the story, now the camp of Midian lay below him in the valley. This is the army. During the night, the Lord said, we're going to come back to this. Uh, the Lord said to Gideon, get up and go down to the camp because I'm going to give it into your hands. Here's the gracious part of what God is doing. If you're afraid, he says to attack, he says to Gideon, go down to the camp with your servant. Just the two of you sneak in and listen to what they're saying. And afterwards, you will be encouraged. God's not even waiting around for Gideon to ask for a sign, to say, I'm struggling in my faith once again. God doesn't condemn him. It's amazing how God works with us, even in our weaknesses. It doesn't say our weaknesses are okay, but God patiently works with us in them. He wants to strengthen our faith and make our faith and our understanding about him grow stronger and stronger all the time. So he and Purah, his servant, went down to the outposts of camp. And the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the other eastern peoples that settled in the valley, they were thick as locusts. Now, we don't really experience locusts here the way they do in the Middle East and some other places. Maybe some do. Maybe there's places I don't know, but we generally don't where I live. But locusts will come as a cloud. There's so many of them. So many. They can't even be counted. The camels could no more be counted than the sand of seashore. There's so many people, so many camels, and the camels were part of, think of it like tanks, right? They're part of what the army had. It doesn't tell us exactly how many here, but if we read this story, and we'll get to a little bit later, not today, in a later podcast, you're going to see there's 135,000 of these guys all camped in this valley. And God says, I want you to go with 300. That is like sending your Pee Wee football team to go play in the Super Bowl. Seriously, 300 men against 135,000. There is no possible way for them to win that battle. Zero, absolutely zero chance. So it's understandable that he would be afraid. And God was working with his fear. Fear is not necessarily a good thing in this case, but God is working with him on it. Go down to the camp, he says. And when you're done, you're going to be really encouraged. So we read Gideon arrived just as a man was telling a friend his dream. He's probably standing outside the tent. He snuck in, he's standing outside the tent. He's trying to just kind of fit in and not be seen. And he hears the man say this, I had a dream. A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp, and it struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed. Think about the word picture. A loaf of bread rolls down a hill. Great big tent, by the way, not a little tent, great big tent. It hits the tent with such force that the whole tent collapses. That's absurd. Our dreams are often absurd, right? When you can actually remember your dream, usually the bits and pieces make no sense when you start to think about it. And this dream would have been like that. A loaf, and I probably should have done a little more study to figure out why barley bread, why is that significant? But the bigger picture is a little loaf of bread knocking down a great big tent that's made to withstand storms and everything else that they have. Doesn't make any sense. And his friend responded, this can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands. Wow. What an encouraging word for Gideon. I want us to come back and look right at the bottom of the page that you're about to see. His friend responds, this can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and whole camp into his hands. Look at his response, Gideon's response. When he heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed down and worshiped. Worship is simply when we express back to God the greatness of who he is and what he has done for us. We typically think of it as something that happens in church, and we call that corporate worship. And maybe even some people would narrow that down in their minds to the singing portion. But all of it is actual worship to God, whether it's our giving, the preaching and teaching of the word, the singing of songs, the giving of testimony, the prayers that go up, all of that corporately. We call it corporate because people are together, doing it together. But I don't know if you think about worship privately. This is just Gideon, or maybe Gideon and his servant. And you know what's interesting to me? Gideon didn't wait till he was back somewhere safely. Apparently, it took place right there in the camp. Gideon was so overcome with the graciousness of God in working with his fears and reassuring him that God would provide the victory. He was so impressed by the greatness of God that right in the moment, it says that he bowed down, which meant he was humbling himself before the Lord and he worshiped. Just him or him and another guy. In this verse, it doesn't even mention his servant. It just says Gideon worshiped the Lord. You ever do that? You ever read the word, think about the events in your own life, think about how God has been so gracious to you, think about how great and good he is, how great his love is for us. how he gave his only son Jesus to come and die on a cross so we could experience the forgiveness of sins. God had nothing to gain by that. He hadn't done anything wrong. He gave the very best that he had, his one and only son. Do you ever just get overwhelmed and just want to worship the Lord on the spot? That's what we should be doing in our lives. That should be our natural response. Yeah, maybe not every day and every moment, but there certainly should be moments in a day, in a week, where we just want to tell the Lord how good he is, how good he has been to us, how great he is, and reflect back to him his own character and his own acts towards us. Gideon, it's a wonderful example. I just had to slow down and tell that little slice of the story before we get on to the actual battle, Lord willing, on Wednesday. Hope that encourages your heart. Hope you have a good couple days, and I look forward to seeing you on Wednesday.